Hi, everyone. My name is Fin Depencier, and I am filling in for Christian today as he is away dealing with a family matter. And today I have with me environmental physicist and PhD candidate Jesse Velay Vitow. Jesse was one of the first people to introduce me to the Liberty community here in Toronto through Students for Liberty back in, I guess, 2017, 2018.
Yeah.
And he's really been a really important leader in that community in Toronto for a long time. So good buddy of mine, glad to have him on the program. How you doing, man?
Doing pretty good. I just actually got back from Vancouver to visit my family for 2 weeks, and so now I'm kind of settling back in. I got back, today's Friday, so I got back Wednesday night.
Yeah.
But aside from that, things are going good, as well as they can be during the times of Corona, so.
And I saw you were fighting on top of a mountain with your buddy.
Yeah, I do have a good friend who does martial arts with me, and every time I get to go into into Vancouver rather, we'd like to throw on the gloves and spar, because we started martial arts the same day 5 years ago.
Yeah. And of course, me and you had a nice little bout in your backyard where gave you a black eye, you just skated my shoulder. It's good fun. So anyway, I'm sure that whenever you do interviews, people are almost they always want to ask you about your knowledge about the environment, right? Because you're an environmental physicist, but you're a remarkably educated guy across a number of domains. So why don't you tell people about the fellowship that you're involved in?
Which one?
Oh, yeah, you have a couple? I don't know.
Yeah.
The one where you the one where you got that really nice headshot for.
Oh, Mercatus. Yeah, sure.
Cicadas, yeah.
Yeah, so last year I was an Oscar Morgenstern Fellow for the Mercatus Center, which is kind of the economic department at George Mason University.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the most libertarian economic department in the U.S. and probably anywhere in the world, I would hazard a guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So an
and
Austrian economic.
yeah, so they actually do both Austrian public choice and Virginian, and I think that's right. Virginian, if I'm getting it right, is the Ostroms, Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom,
Okay.
who kind of pioneered these ideas of how you can get management of public resources without a state.
Mm-hmm.
Eleanor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize in economics for, I can't remember what exactly the Nobel Prize was for, but her work was like in managing waterways, how different groups of people manage public resources. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so I got that fellowship largely because a friend of mine, Matt Buffton, who runs the Institute for Liberal Studies, I was at one of their events in Ottawa, and he said, to everyone in the room, Mercatus is looking for fellows. Why don't you guys apply? And I said, well, I'm not exactly an economist. In fact, I'm
Mm-hmm.
pretty far from an economist. I study the movement of ice and ice-ocean interactions. And he
Mm-hmm.
said, I know, you're a libertarian. You should try applying. So
Yeah.
I sent in an application to their Oscar Morgenstern Fellowship, which is their one for people who are more quantitative. And I'm like, well, I do math for a living, so I'm pretty quantitative.
Yeah.
And I guess I made a good pitch and I got it. And so what that entailed was going to, I want to say Arlington, but it's somewhere in the DC area. I can't remember
Yeah.
the exact
Yeah.
town. For these short little colloquia. You go and talk about stuff, you meet with other people. It was nice. There's actually one other kind of environmental person there, which was interesting. She was more on the policy side of things, but it was cool. So yeah, I did that. And then this year I'm a Don Lavoie Fellow with Mercatus again, which is their
Mm-hmm.
new online fellowship, which has been launched due to Corona. So
Mm-hmm.
that's fun. Applying for libertarian economist fellowships is kind of my side gig.
So are those the only two that you're involved with, or are there more?
So those are the two that I've been involved with in terms of libertarianism
Mm-hmm.
and economy and stuff like that. I have other scholarships, but I don't want to just like read down my CV.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Of course not. Well, let's get one item off your CV though. Why don't you tell everybody about what you're doing in your PhD?
sure. So what I'm doing in my PhD is broadly speaking, environmental physics, more narrowly speaking, paleoclimate history, which means looking at the historical climate of the Earth and trying to figure out what was happening what the mechanisms were that created change, and
Mm-hmm.
extremely narrowly, what I work on is the interactions of high amplitude tides with the edges of ice sheets. So just very briefly, if you have an ice sheet that's grounded in the ocean, it's going to have a floating shelf of ice, and that floating shelf of ice will be able to flex with the tides. So if you have a large enough amplitude tide, it can destabilize the ice sheet, and then you start getting a faster disgorgement of icebergs, which increases melt rates. So this applies a lot historically. There are these things called Heinrich events, which are one of the main things I study. Hudson Strait spits out a bunch of icebergs.
Yep.
But in the present day, where it could be applied usefully is on these various glaciers and ice streams in Greenland and Antarctica. For example, if a tsunami or a rogue wave were to hit these, it's possible they could destabilize, and then our melt rate would change for a few hundred years from about 3 millimeters a year, I think, to much more than that. So we'd have to kind of update our plans on how to deal with rising sea levels.
And so you're concerned with the history of the climate, or a paleoclimate, right?
Yeah.
Not so much concerned with predicting the future of the climate, but but you do still have the aptitude. So I wanted to ask you about the dramatic drop off in CO2 emissions during the coronavirus lockdown. I mean, so CO2 emissions exponentially dropped for about, I don't know, 2 months, and now they've picked up to, I'm not sure if they've normalized, but they've gotten back pretty close to normal levels. Does that short-term change have any impact on the climate that is measurable? I mean, or at least on specifically with ocean temperatures and the melting of the ice sheets?
Yeah. So one of the things to consider here is that there's different residence times, right? So it takes longer for CO2 to filter out of, say, the ocean than it does out of the air in a room, right? Because there's different times like this. So I think that actually a lot of really good studies are going to come out of the coronavirus time, because we're going to be able to look at what are the short-term effects of dramatically reducing CO2 emissions. We'll be able to say, because we have probes in the upper atmosphere, and we have probes in the ocean measuring CO2 levels. Not me personally, but they exist in the scientific community. And so we'll be able to say, okay, so if we tank CO2 for 2 months by X percent, what percent and at what lag rate is that coming out of the oceans? Is that coming out of the atmosphere, or reverse? It might be going into the ocean. And I think that that's going to be very interesting. I think that one thing that ties into libertarianism is that this may be used as a proof of concept for radical environmentalists.
Absolutely.
To say, see, we can do this. And I mean, yes, we can, but it's always a question of matching costs and benefits. Now, you know, climate change is 100% real. I mean, I can't study it without knowing that. But I think one thing that needs to be worked into the conversation is the economic effects, because economic effects are really effects upon human beings, right? I think we tend to like to pretend in this conversation that economic effects really only hit like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, but at the end of the day, economic effects also hit, you know, Joe the truck driver or Jill the hairdresser, right? Like these things, you know, who makes the money, who works for it? Human beings. What do they use that money for? To buy food, to clothe their kids, right? So I think that those conversations need to happen. And I think that this is going to be a very interesting piece of that puzzle scientifically moving forward.
Yeah, and economically speaking, this is what's known as modern monetary theory, right? The idea that you can perpetually print your own currency, the central bank can just continue printing currency, and it doesn't matter how much it doesn't matter how large the deficit gets, because we'll always be able to print more of that same currency. And proponents of that theory are definitely going to look at the dramatic expansion of money supplies across the world, and see it as justified. But I mean, almost every economist worth their salt knows that that's completely unsustainable, including Paul Krugman, who's certainly the most renowned left-wing economist.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that, like, when even Paul Krugman is telling you to cool the printing presses, maybe it's time to like give it a rest.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, so what is your solution for climate change, or what are some mitigating solutions?
Oh, okay.
So last time I was with you, we were talking about carbon capturing, and I know you're not an expert at this, but this is a very, very interesting solution. Essentially what it does is you suck carbon dioxide out of the air, usually at the source, like at the top of the smokestack. Why don't you explain?
Well, there's two main divisions that you can think of. There's like point of emission capture, where you put something over a smokestack so the emissions never get out into the atmosphere, or at a reduced rate, or like general atmosphere filtering, where you're trying to pull what's already there out of it. So I think point of emission is way more reasonable, because it very easily ties the producer to the solution, right? If I have a smokestack, I have to deal with it. When you're dealing with pulling it out of international air, you now start to deal with issues of whose job is it, whose responsibility is it. You have a collective action problem. And I think the other kind of interesting angle, I think you and I spoke about this briefly, is that different countries have different preferred levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. For example, countries near the equator, they're already pretty hot, right? I mean, I think it was a few years back where there was a heat wave in sub-Saharan Africa, which just made it intolerable to live. I could be getting this wrong. It might have been in India. But places in the north, like Canada and Russia, we're kind of okay if things get a little bit warmer, because it allows us to have longer growing seasons and more arable land. So you kind of get into this question of who gets to decide what the optimal carbon dioxide level of the planet is. And I think that this is kind of a question that needs to be dealt with eventually. But in terms of solutions to climate change, I mean, my long-term preferred solution is just, terraforming other planets. But that's very far away.
Well, it's naive to ask for you to give me a solution, because it doesn't seem to be the problem that we can immediately solve. I mean, if anything, we can mitigate the effects of climate change.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of an issue where, like, people point to climate change as like a principal example of like market failure, where the market is not able to respond quick enough to deal with like the environmental issues. Now, I'm not sure that's the case. I think it might just be that the incentives are structured the wrong way. But it's hard. I mean, I think technology is going to get us out of this, honestly. I don't think politics is going to be the solution here. I think someone somewhere is going to develop a reasonable green vehicle. Like just recently, actually, I think they made a technological breakthrough, at least theory-wise, in lithium-ion batteries to cheapen their construction and to cheapen the carbon footprint. So something like that moving forward, I think, is the way to do it, is just to make electric cars sexy, rather than trying to convince people that they have to take a hit to their quality of life, which is really a Malthusian argument in a real way, right? That we need to all suffer a little bit more to prevent overpopulation, for example. But in this case, it's climate crisis.
Now, what do you think about, now this is a different environmental problem, but it's either Bjorn Lomborg or Boyan Slot, the Ocean Cleanup Project, where they are, have you heard about this? It's essentially these massive nets stretch over hundreds and hundreds of miles in the middle of the Pacific Ocean to try to clean up the Pacific garbage patch. Do you have anything interesting to comment about that?
Yeah, so one of the difficulties here is that in kind of a tip of the iceberg type metaphor, what's floating on top and is visible is really a small part of the problem. The issue is the particulate plastics that are floating in the water column and being eaten by fish. So big nets are not going to solve that. They will definitely help, and they will help mitigate the future problem, because of course the plastic breaks up and disintegrates, and that's what creates the particulate matter. But for that, it's a very tough problem, right? How do you filter an ocean? There's a lot of water. And also the issue with plastic is that you can't attract it magnetically. You
Hmm.
can't really do much to it. Um,
Now,
one,
that being said, I do know a guy who is doing his master's in microbiology or something, and in his research lab, they're working on
plastic
developing.
eating bacteria.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was just going to
Exactly.
say that the
Yeah.
solution is something along those lines where you put plastic eating bacteria. You just have to be careful with that, because when you're releasing a bacteria into the world, you want to really make sure that it doesn't do
Hmm.
anything you're not
Just
expecting
like
it
the
to do.
COVID-19 vaccine, we do not want to unleash horrible unintended consequence when
Yeah,
you're
I mean, the
radically
example
changing systems.
the
Yeah.
example they give is that if you release plastic eating bacteria into the ocean, how long does it take until suddenly all the gaskets are melting on planes because of
Hmm.
the rain that they're hitting, because there's the bacteria there? So you have to be careful. I mean, the way it would make me most comfortable is to take water out, eat the plastic, and put it back in. Now that would be a dilution process.
Right.
Time. Uh, I don't know.
Right.
Again,
I don't know anything about that. I
totally
mean,
outside my field of expertise.
yeah.
But it brings to mind like the nanobot like gray goo scenario where you release something and it just
Hmm.
eats everything, like all the plastic. And we rely on plastic. We're all we're wearing plastic right now. My contacts are plastic, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. And same with petroleum, right? I mean, there's so many important products that we use in our everyday life that I'm not sure if the general public have a petroleum base, like your toothbrush, your phone
yep.
case. I mean, it's all dye. It's all a petroleum based product. Um, so I want to ask you quickly about nuclear energy. I think you're a proponent. Uh,
100%. Nuclear
yeah,
energy is the way to go.
and I think that one of the reasons why there's seems to be this impasse with people on the left and the right supporting nuclear energy. I mean, on the right, you have governments that are beholden to natural gas and big
Yeah.
oil interests, and then on the left, it doesn't. I mean, it isn't conducive with completely transforming the economy, and it's also sacrificing your local environment to attempt to solve the global environment.
There's also another angle, which is nuclear disarmament, right?
Hmm.
In that the left tends to not want governments to have nuclear capabilities. And so if
Hmm.
you have nuclear energy, their idea is that therefore you have nukes. The two
Hmm.
are associated. Now, in a certain sense, that's true. Like the requisite skills required to run a reactor are somewhat transferable to the requisite skills to build a nuclear bomb, but not exactly, right? Like, um, it doesn't have to be that way. And then the thing about safety, which comes up a lot because of Fukushima, I always get this wrong. Is it 3 Mile Island? I can never
And
remember the number. It's some Mile Island and
okay,
Chernobyl, which are the
yeah.
examples of these meltdowns. Now, what is a meltdown? Most people don't really know, and that's fine because it's kind of a niche thing. A meltdown is when in a nuclear reaction you have three main components: the fuel, the reaction moderator. I think I might be getting that term wrong, but that's what it does, and the coolant, right?
Hmm.
And so what a meltdown happens is when you run out of coolant, like for example in Chernobyl, all of the water
Hmm.
went away, or in Fukushima, it got hit by a tsunami and the water drained out, something along those lines. All you have is a hypercritical reaction, which will continue because you have a moderator to continue it and a fuel source. So different types of nuclear reactors combine various types of these three ingredients
Yeah.
into one. So the safest one is something called a molten salt reactor. Now, what it does is in that case, let me get this right. The moderator is the coolant. So if the coolant were to disappear, there'd be no more moderator, and you'd just
Hmm.
have a fuel, which wouldn't go critical. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but this is roughly what's going on. And
Yeah.
so you set it up in such a way that if the coolant is gone, there's no more reaction, so you don't have to worry about it. And these are very safe. They're still, I believe, in
Hmm.
active development, but they could produce a large amount of
Yeah.
energy,
Exponentially more than wind and solar,
and they're not dependent on cloudy days or wind.
no, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when Germany tried to completely shut off all its coal plants. I think in the early 2000s, they had to start them back up again, because turns out when the sun goes down, solar panels aren't yielding any energy. The other thing about nuclear energy is, like you said, I mean, it's getting safer. And I think that also, like you said, it is going to be technological solutions that solve climate change, not political solutions. And I think that, I mean, eventually we should get to a point where water supplies aren't compromised as much. I mean, and that seems, I mean, I'm not an expert at all, but that seems to be the biggest problem with nuclear energy, is the danger to local water supplies, right? And
Yeah.
well, with the exception of the obviously meltdown, but every nuclear reactor, it compromises water supplies, if I'm not mistaken.
I mean, because with the coolant, at least, when you're using water as a coolant, it's going to get irradiated. So that's one issue. But again, I think this is just a matter of, cost benefit analysis. I mean, we've decided that having huge landfills is a reasonable way to use land. So it seems to me that you could also make the argument that, having nuclear power somewhere. Now, of course, the issue is that you don't want it too far from civilization, because you incur power losses in efficiency by having to move the power a long way.
Sure.
But I still think it's reasonable. I mean, if I ever ran for office, my platform would be, a tokamak in every city over 100,000 people. It's just we need nuclear proliferation for energy, because it's not renewable, but it is clean, right? Because we can, in effect, run out of uranium or other fissionable materials eventually.
But that's not likely to happen anytime soon, right?
Yeah, I don't know what the global stocks of. I mean, if I remember correctly, this is just vaguely. I remember seeing a graph, like when you run out of oil, when you run out of coal, because there's more coal than oil, and it's like when you run out of uranium. Like it's just it gives us more wiggle room.
Okay, why don't we move on past the environment? Because like I said, you're a very educated guy, and you have your insights are very, very valuable across the board. You said earlier you wanted to talk a little bit about an analogy between the unrest we're seeing in North America right now and the collapse of the Athenian of Athens, right?
Yeah. So I mean, Periclean Athens is considered one of the golden ages of human history. The other one being the Renaissance. It's one of those weird times where things conspire just right to have art, philosophy, science, all just hitting their stride at the right time. I mean, even today, if you quote someone from philosophy, there's a good chance they're either from Periclean Athens or around there, temporally, or in the Renaissance, or I mean in the last 100 years or so. But we tend to quote people who are near to us as well. So one of the things that I think is interesting, and for anyone who's interested in this, the second half of the second book by William Durant, which is The Story of Civilization. It's an 11-volume series covering everything, more or less. Covers this very well, and that's principally where I'm drawing my opinions on this from. But the point he raises is that as Athens is kind of collapsing now, Athens has had a long history of wars. There's been fights with Sparta for supremacy of the Greek city-states. No Greek city-state has ever really been able to gather them all together and create an empire. Athens made a good shot of it, which is the Athenian Empire. They try that a second time, but doesn't really well. And what they see in their society is that the middle class gets eroded because of the way that the economy is set up, and over time, the poor people. The way William Durant phrases it is that the middle class is a moderator between an obdurate aristocracy that will never change and a radical underclass that wants to a utopian underclass. So kind of like between dystopia and utopia, and as the middle class erodes, which is what we've seen in North America over the last 20 years, there's no longer a moderator to kind of keep the peace. And so what you do is you have the rich that are trying to keep power, and you have a larger and larger numerous poorer class, lower class, that seeks to take power. And so when the lower class does take power, what do? Well, they increase taxes, they confiscate property and money from the rich.
Yeah, expropriation.
And they create social programs. And now Athens had for a very long time actually had a kind of form of basic income. The idea being that everyone had a right to attend the theater, so they got a little bit of money every year to attend the theater. Now I think most people didn't use it to attend the theater; they used it to manage their lives. But so they
had the discretion. That's interesting.
Yeah, I believe they did. Again, not my area of expertise. You should get an actual Greek historian on this to talk on this sometime. But yeah, so what occurs then is the rich don't really want to lose their money. So what they do is they find cleverer and cleverer ways of hiding it. So what the poor do, who still have control of like the house, or the equivalent of the house, you know, the Senate, there's a word, kind of Congress.
I'm not sure.
They create a police force of like tax collectors to go in and find wealth that people are hiding. Another thing that they institute is like these policies where they take a geographical region, and they're like, you're the richest guy here, so you're going to pay the tax for the entire region, and then it's up to you to figure out how to equitably distribute that.
Okay.
So kind of interesting. Yeah.
Sort of provincialism.
Yeah, but it's like then people would deke them, right? You know, try and not pay their taxes to the local guy. I was gonna say it also sows discord in the community. But yeah, and so as this goes on and on, the rich get more and more antagonistic and stop seeing themselves as kind of like patrons of the civilization, whereas historically, people would be willing to donate money to like fund a fleet or to create a theater because they saw themselves as like part of Athens. And as time goes on, they're more like, those people are not us, right? And so I think that's what we've, in broad strokes. I mean, again, if you had someone who knew this more in depth, they could probably point to more specific examples. But I think this is similar to what we've experienced here, is that a decay of the middle class, and then an incompatibilism between the view of society that the rich have and a view of society that the poor have, to the point where at least in the US, I would say that we're pretty close to the point where the Overton windows of the left and the right almost don't overlap anymore. I mean, like, what can they really agree on at this point?
Yeah, I mean, there used to be a couple institutions that the left and the right always held in high regard. You know, like the military, like I don't know, certain public services. But I think it's a very good analogy. The middle class is like this buffer between the very rich and the very poor, and now you have an aristocracy that is feels like they're shielding themselves from an ingrateful lower class and an underclass that's really feels like they're getting the short end of the stick. And you know, I mean, the reason I wanted to ask you to explain this in depth is because everybody makes the analogy between the collapse of America and the collapse of the Roman Empire, but I haven't heard the Periclean Athens.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it too until I read Will Durant's book, which was published in like the 40s, I think, right? So it's and he doesn't draw this comparison himself. It's just when I was reading it, it kind of struck me that there were parallels. And I mean, the counter argument you could make is that we haven't really got to the point yet where the poor are actually taking seats in Congress. But I'd argue that that someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is an example of someone who was working as like a bartender. I believe that's correct, and has now risen to be in the House. I mean, so it's just starting. But I think we might see more of those kind of popular left-wing people raising up into positions of power. Now, I was going to say, what remains to be seen is whether or not Cortez sticks with that, or if, as time goes on, she becomes a member of the rich.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this comedian I really like, Tim Dillon, said that, you know, she'll be on the board of JP Morgan Chase and their diversity department anytime now, right? And I mean, I don't know how principled she is. I mean, we'll see. And you also wonder if working class people from the right will end up becoming members of government, members of high society. I mean, I think I can't think of anybody who's sitting in government now who came from such modest means as Cortez. I mean, well, there's a newly elected congressman. I think it's Madison Cawthorn. He's 24 years old. He's a Republican. He won in North Carolina. So he's a pretty modest guy, but
yeah, I mean, I
but
think I was just going to say that one of the issues here
continue.
with like the left and right divide is that in a lot of other countries, it's really a three-party system or three-party poll between liberal, labor, and conservative. So in the U.S., the labor has always kind of played this game of flopping between one and the other, right? Which is why, you know, that's a large reason why Trump won, is that he was able to court like the right-wing labor movement in the Great Lakes region, right? And so it's very interesting. This is, I think it's kind of the a piece of the puzzle that doesn't get talked a lot about, is that, you know, there is a group of people that like right-wing people who are pro-union, right? Like they're conservative at home, but they're real strong members of their union. An example of that in Canada is like the NDP of like way back. They were union people. And over time, the unions have shifted more and more progressive, which is kind of interesting because I would imagine that there's a disconnect between the leadership and the membership on that.
With the exception of police unions.
Yeah, but yeah, police unions are a whole nother beast themselves, right? Like, those like deserve an almost completely separate analysis, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think one of the big problems that the left is having across the board in the Western world right now is they have all these infighting factions that aren't compatible with one another. I mean, you have union movements, you have postmodern college graduates, you have new immigrants who end up being very socially conservative sometimes. And so the internal dynamics of that alliance isn't sustainable once they get into government.
For sure. And I mean, to tie back into the Roman theme, one of my favorite Roman writers of all time is Juvenal. And he's one of a very good satirist. And there's, I remember when I first read him, I was just struck by how much what he was saying could almost have come out of Trump's mouth if you modulated the language a little bit, because he's complaining about the same things, right? I think he's Fall of Rome, so I think it's 5th or 6th century, something like that. Again, I don't remember the exact date. But he basically says, so what are the problems with Rome? Well, we have all these immigrants, and historically they would like become Roman, right? They came from Gaul, but now they're Roman. Now they're Gauls inside of Rome, right? So that's one thing he's criticizing. The next thing he's criticizing is the loose sexual morals of their women. He's like, what is this? These women, they're sleeping around, they're doing all this stuff, they're not at home raising good Roman kids. And the third thing he says, which I think is interesting, is the erosion of the guest right. Now, guest right is just the idea that when you go to someone's house, they take care of you and they don't kill you, right? Like you are a protected member when you're at someone's house. And so he says, you know, it used to be you go over to your buddy's house, and even if you can't offer him any business or money, he gives you a good piece of bread and a nice chair with armrests, and you're sitting at the table. And now you go and you're lucky if you get a crust of bread, a crust of moldy bread, and like a stool. So he's actually criticizing something that the right doesn't usually criticize, which is like the breakdown of, well, I guess they do in some way, like the breakdown of societal cohesion and the idea of community. And so I think that this is interesting because those are a lot of the same complaints that you see today in the US, is that, you know, people don't take care of each other. The sexual moral one, it's more on the right, but like the right does complain about that. And then immigration, definitely, I can see people complain about that. Now, I'm not saying I agree with Juvenal. I just think that it's an interesting parallel to draw, that like empires as they fall have similarities.
Absolutely. I mean, it's uncanny, really, the resemblance between what happened to ancient Rome, what's happening to the United States. It just became, overexpanded, too many institutions that had lost trust. All right. Anything else you want to say to tie this up? I think we should call it time. Christian usually does these at 30 minutes, and I think we've gone at least like 40. So.
Oh yeah, I guess we did start a little early. Okay.
Yeah. All right, man. I really appreciate it. Hope
for
to have
sure.
you on again soon. I'll see you soon. Peace.
All right. Have a good one.